The last thing I felt, the first time I died, was the rhythm of a race I never ran. I was 40 years old, sitting at a gray desk in a gray dispatch office routing other people's freight across a country I never went anywhere in, and somewhere behind my left eye a vessel that had been waiting my whole adult life finally let go. The doctors had a long word for it. I don't use the word. What I remember is that in the half-second before the lights went out, my body, my soft, neglected, 40-year-old body that hadn't run a real step in 17 years, suddenly remembered exactly what it was for. The blocks under my feet. The gun. The first 4 strides where you're still a person, and then the long curve where you stop being a person and become an engine made of lactic acid and refusal. My feet remembered a 400 meters I had never gotten to run, the one that mattered, the one I skipped, and the soles of them pulsed with the ghost of it as my heart did its last few beats. That is a cruel thing for a body to do to you on your way out, to hand you back, for one instant, the thing you threw away. But bodies are honest like that. They keep the accounts even when you've stopped looking at the books. And then I opened my eyes and I was 18, and the rhythm wasn't a ghost anymore. It was my own pulse, hammering because I'd woken mid-stride. I want to take you back to who I was before any of it because you can't understand what I did unless you understand what running was to me, and running was not a hobby. Running was the door I got out through. I grew up in a house that was loud in all the wrong ways and quiet in all the wrong places, a house where nobody came to anything, where the fridge was a rumor and the shouting was a fact. And the first time I ran, really ran, a full-effort sprint across a field at 12 because a gym teacher said, "Let's see who's fastest," I crossed that field and understood, in my whole body, that there was a place where none of the house could follow me. Let me be specific about the house, because the specifics are why the track meant what it meant. My mother was there, and not there, present in body, checked out in every way that counts, a woman so worn down by her own disappointments that she had nothing left over for a daughter. And so I learned early that if I wanted to become for, I would have to become the kind of person people came for, which is a terrible thing for a child to conclude and a hard thing to unlearn. My father had left when I was small, and what followed him through our door over the years was a rotating cast of his replacements, none of them cruel exactly, all of them indifferent, the house filling and emptying with men who looked through me like I was furniture. I made myself small and useful and easy, because small and useful and easy was the only currency I'd found that bought a little safety. I became, before I was even 10, an expert at sensing what other people needed and providing it before they had to ask, the exact skill, I understand now, that Mason would one day exploit without ever having to lift a finger to do it. I was pre-trained for him. The house built the girl who'd skip her own race for a careless boy, years before the boy ever showed up. And then there was the track. On the track there was no mother who didn't get up, no father who got up and left, no rotating cast of his replacements. There was only the lane and the clock, and me, and the clock did not care where I came from. The clock was the first thing in my life that treated me fairly. You ran what you ran. It didn't matter if your house was loud, if nobody came to your meets, if you taught yourself to be small everywhere else. On the track, the clock gave you exactly what your legs earned, no more and no less, and that exactness was the most beautiful thing I had ever encountered. I fell in love with it the way you fall in love with the first thing that's ever been fair to you. The track was where I went to stop being small. It was the one place I was allowed to take up the whole lane. And the cruelest thing Mason ever did, crueler than the morning itself, was to reach into the one fair place I'd ever found and ask me to give it away to make his life easier, and to do it so warmly that I mistook it for being needed, which to a girl raised invisible is indistinguishable from being loved. By the time I was 18, I ran the 400 meters faster than any girl in the state, and I ran it the way Coach Reyes taught me, which was to treat it as a held breath, go out hard but controlled, hit the back straight already hurting, and then, in the final 100 where everyone's legs turn to wet cement, win it on the one thing that can't be coached, the absolute refusal to be the person who slows down. Coach Reyes had run in the Olympics once a long time ago, and she did not hand out belief like candy, and she told me, leaning on the fence in the cold one evening after everyone else had gone home, that I had the rarest thing in the sport, which was a fourth gear in the place where other runners only had a wall. Anybody can be fast when it doesn't hurt, she said. You get faster when it starts to hurt. I've coached for 30 years. I've seen that maybe 4 times. She looked at me with those flat, assessing eyes. Don't waste it, Carter. The body's got a short window, and the world's got a long list of reasons you should give it to somebody else. Don't. I wasted it. In my first life, at the one moment the whole window came down to, I gave it to somebody else, and I have spent 2 lifetimes learning the exact weight of what that cost. Let me tell you about Mason Hale, because A Man You Don't Understand is just a cartoon, and Mason was no cartoon. He was a hurdler, a good one, 110 meters, all long, clean lines over the barriers, and he was the kind of beautiful that makes a girl from a loud house feel like she's been let into a room she didn't think she was allowed in.
He noticed me.
That was the whole of it, at first. Mason Hale, who everyone watched me, and a girl who'd grown up invisible will follow that attention anywhere, will reorganize her entire life around the warmth of finally being seen. We started dating at 17. He told me I was different from other girls, which I now understand is the oldest hook there is, the thing men say right before they start filing down the parts of you that make you different.
But I didn't know that then.
I knew only that the boy everyone wanted me, and I held on to it with both hands. Here's the thing about Mason that took me dying to see. Mason did not have a cruel bone in his body, and that made him more dangerous than a cruel man, not less. A cruel man you can leave. Mason was careless, carelessly charming, carelessly entitled, carelessly certain that the people around him existed to smooth his road, and the carelessness came wrapped in such genuine warmth that you could spend years mistaking it for love. He had grown up the golden boy of a tired single mother and a worshipful younger brother, the one the whole family organized itself around, and he had never once in his life had to wonder whether his needs would be met, because they always had been, by women who decided that meeting Mason's needs was simply what you did. I became one of those women. I didn't notice it happening. That's how it always goes. You don't notice the water getting warmer until you're already cooked. His brother was named Toby, and I want to be careful about Toby because Toby matters and Toby is not the villain of this. Toby was 14, gangly and earnest and a little lost, the way the younger brothers of golden boys often are, raised in the shade of someone brighter. He worshipped Mason. He also, I think, was a little starved for the kind of attention that wasn't about Mason, and I gave it to him because I knew exactly what it was to be the kid nobody came for, and so Toby and I were genuinely friends, in both my lives separate from anything to do with his brother. Remember that. It becomes important. The thing the whole window came down to was trials day. Holloway University ran the only athletic scholarship program in the region worth having, a fully funded squad place, the thing that turned a fast kid with a chaotic home into a person with a future, the thing I had been pointing my entire life at since the day I crossed that field at 12. The squad was selected once a year, on a single day of time trials by Coach Reyes, who'd moved up to coach the university program. Limited spots. A fixed roster across the events. You ran your trial, and your time either bought you a place or it didn't, and there was no second day and no appeal, and no next year for a senior because after trials day the window I'd been warned about closed for good. I had been the fastest 400 runner in the state for 2 years. That place was mine to lose. And Mason was on the bubble. He was a good hurdler but not a great one, right at the edge of the last roster spot, the kind of athlete who could make the squad on a clean focus day and miss it on a bad one. He knew it. The pressure of it had been eating at him for weeks. The morning of trials day in my first life, Toby went down. Nothing serious. He rolled his ankle badly playing pickup the night before, swollen and painful but not broken, the kind of injury that needs ice and a clinic visit and someone to mind a scared 14-year-old for a day. Their mother couldn't take off work. She'd lose the shift, maybe the job. So someone had to be Toby's person for the day. And Mason, beautiful, careless, certain Mason, looked at the problem, and looked at me, and arrived instantly at the solution that cost him nothing. You have to take Toby, he told me that morning, and I can still hear the exact shape of it, the way it wasn't even a question. Skip your trial and be my injured brother's crutch for the day. You're so good with him, he trusts you, and I can't be driving him to clinics and sitting in waiting rooms today. This is my one shot. Sloan, this is everything I've worked for. You can run track anytime. Family is family. He needs you. You can run track anytime. I want you to hear that lie the way I eventually heard it because it's the whole murder weapon in a single sentence.
There was no anytime.
It was trials day, once a year, and I was a senior, and the window Coach Reyes had warned me about was standing wide open for exactly that one morning and would never open again. Mason either knew that and said it anyway, or didn't bother to know, and I have gone back and forth my whole death over which is worse. But the deeper thing in that sentence, the thing I couldn't see at 17, was the arithmetic underneath it. Toby was Mason's brother. The obligation was Mason's. And Mason had looked at his own family obligation and his own race, and decided that the way to keep both was to hand the obligation to me and keep the race for himself. He wasn't asking me to help his brother. He was asking me to absorb his responsibility so that it would cost him nothing, and he was calling that family, and he was calling it love. And I did it. God, I did it. I drove Toby to the clinic and sat in the waiting room and held his hand while they wrapped his ankle and bought him a terrible vending machine lunch and made him laugh. And I was good at it, I was kind, and the whole time, 2 miles away, the gun was going off on the one race of my life, and I was not in the blocks. I remember the exact moment, in that first life, when I knew. I was sitting in the clinic waiting room on a hard plastic chair next to a 14-year-old with a wrapped ankle, and I looked at my phone and it was 10 o'clock, and I knew that 2 miles away Coach Reyes was calling the 400 to their marks, and I knew that she was looking at lane 4 where my name was on her clipboard, and there was no one in it, and I sat in that chair and felt my entire future close like a door in another room, quietly with a soft click, the way the most important doors always close. I didn't cry. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was being a good person, that this was what love looked like, that Coach Reyes would understand, that there'd be other chances. I told myself 100 soft lies on that plastic chair, and not one of them was true, and the truest thing in the room was the clock on the wall ticking past 10 while a girl who'd been born to run sat still and let her one window close so that a careless boy wouldn't have to be inconvenienced by his own family. Toby, beside me, said, "Thanks for staying with me, Sloan." Mason was too busy. And I smiled and said, "Of course, buddy. Anytime. Anytime." I gave away my whole life with that word, and I smiled while I did it, and that is the image of my first self I most needed to come back and correct. A girl smiling in a waiting room while the gun goes off without her. I missed my trial. Coach Reyes called my name, and I wasn't there. And a place I had earned with a decade of pre-dawn mornings went unclaimed, and the window came down. And Mason, fresh, unburdened, his brother safely offloaded onto the girl who loved him, ran a clean focus trial and made the last roster spot by the width of a held breath. He got the future. I got the waiting room. I never made a squad after that. There was no other program, no other day, no other window. I ran a little, bitterly for a while, in races that led nowhere, and then I stopped because every time I laced my spikes I had to stand in the lane next to the ghost of the girl who skipped her own trial to be a crutch, and I couldn't stand next to her. So I put the spikes in a box. Let me stay in that box for a second because it's the truest object in this story. They were good spikes, the first real pair I ever owned, bought with money I'd saved from a summer job because my family certainly wasn't buying them, the spikes I'd run my fastest times in, the spikes that still had the dried mud of 100 pre-dawn mornings in their cleats. And one gray afternoon, a year or two after I quit, I took them off the shelf to throw them out, and I stood over the trash with them in my hand, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't throw them away, and I couldn't run in them, so I did the coward's third thing. I put them in a box and shoved the box to the back of a closet, where they sat for 17 years, through 4 apartments and a dozen gray jobs, mud-cleated and unworn, a small dark monument to the girl I'd buried alive on trials day. I never opened the box, but I always knew exactly where it was. You always know where you keep the thing you can't look at. I got a job, then another job, the gray kind, the kind where your body is just the thing that carries your head to a desk. Mason and I didn't even last. That's the part that still makes me laugh, a hard laugh with no joy in it. He made the squad, and within a year he'd outgrown the girl from the loud house, found people who fit his bright new life better, and drifted off without much ceremony, and I was left having traded my entire future for a relationship that didn't survive the very season I sacrificed it for. I gave up the 400 meters for a boy who wasn't even there a year later. And the body I'd abandoned took its revenge slowly, the way abandoned things do. I stopped moving, stopped running, let the grief clench down on a body built to fly until it forgot how, And somewhere in all those gray sedentary years, a small vessel behind my left eye began to thin and bulge, unnoticed, unhurried, patient. I died at 40 in a dispatch office on an ordinary afternoon, mid-keystroke, routing a freight load I'd never see, and the last thing I felt was the soles of my feet remembering a race I never ran. And then I woke up mid-stride, 18 years old, on the back straight of the Holloway practice track, my lungs full of cold morning air and my legs already moving. I nearly went down. You try waking up inside a body you buried 17 years before, mid-sprint, and see if your knees hold. The world swam and reformed, and I staggered out of my lane and stood there with my hands on my knees, heaving, while the rest of the morning training group flowed past me, and a girl I half remembered, Priya, a middle-distance runner, my training partner in a life she didn't know we'd shared, jogged back and put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Carter, you good? You just kind of died out there." And I started laughing, this wild, cracked laugh, because she had no idea, because "you just kind of died out there" was the funniest and truest thing anyone had ever said to me, and Priya looked alarmed, and I waved her off, and I straightened up, and I looked around at the track in the gray morning, and the date assembled itself in my mind, and I understood.
It was 4 days before trials day.
I was 18 in the body that still had the fourth gear, on the track that was still the cleanest justice I'd ever known, for days before the morning I threw it all away. And this time, I knew every step of the trap because I'd already sprung it once with my own 2 feet. I did not cry. I want to be straight with you, the way the track taught me to be straight, because the soft version of this story has me weeping with gratitude, and the real version is harder than that. What I felt, standing on that back straight, was the cold, flat clarity of a runner who has lost a race by a margin she's spent years replaying and has just been handed, against every rule of the universe, a chance to run it again. The disorientation took a few days to wear off, and I won't pretend it didn't because the stories never tell you about the vertigo of coming back. I kept reaching for the aches of a 40-year-old body and finding an 18-year-old's instead, springy and unbroken, a body that could do things mine hadn't done in 2 decades. I kept flinching at people I knew the whole sad futures of, Priya, who in my other life would drift away, Coach Reyes, who in my other life would stand at a start line and call my name to an empty lane. I kept having to stop myself from speaking to all of them like a woman who'd lost them years ago, which I had. For about a week the world felt like a race I'd already run, every stride familiar before I took it, and some animal part of me kept waiting for the lights to come up and dump me back in the gray dispatch office with the vessel about to go. But the track was real under my feet every morning, and the fourth gear was real in my legs, and slowly the vertigo burned off and left the hard, clean certainty underneath, that this was not a dream and not a mercy I'd earned, just a window thrown open one more time, for days before it would slam, and that I was not going to spend those 4 days dizzy. I had a race to run. More than that, I had a girl to dig back up, the one I'd buried in a box at the back of a closet, and put back in her own blocks where she belonged. And underneath the clarity, lower down in the soles of my feet, was something close to joy, because I could feel the track again. The body was back. The fourth gear was back. Even if the squad had been gone forever, I think I'd have dropped to my knees on that track and kissed it just to have my own fast young body return to me. The revenge, whatever it turned out to be, was going to run second to that. The first thing was that I could run again. Everything else was just what came from refusing, this time, to stop. The 4 days before trials day were strange and bright, and the strangest part was all of them being alive again. Mason, beautiful and careless and not yet exposed. Toby, 14 and whole-ankled for now. Coach Reyes leaning on her fence. Priya, my training partner, who in my first life I'd lost along with everything else. I moved through those 4 days like a sprinter walking the track before a race, knowing every camber and crack, except the track was my own life and the cracks were the places it had broken. I went to Coach Reyes first. Not strategy, gratitude. She'd given me the truest thing anyone gave me, the belief that the fourth gear was real and worth protecting, and in my first life I'd repaid her by not showing up to the one race that mattered, by making her stand at the start with my name on her list and an empty lane where I should have been. So on the first day of my second life, I stayed after training and I told her plainly, I'm going to run the best 400 of my life on trials day. Whatever happens, whatever anyone needs from me that morning, I'm going to be in those blocks. She looked at me with those flat Olympic eyes, the eyes that had seen everything and believed almost nothing, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Something's different about you this week." And I said, "Yeah." And she didn't ask what, because she was not a woman who needed the inside of things explained, and she just nodded slowly and said, "Good. Then be in the blocks. The world's going to give you a reason not to be. It always does, right at the worst moment, and you're going to tell it no." She didn't know she was describing the exact shape of my death. I never told her, but I have carried that sentence into every hard morning since. The world's going to give you a reason not to be, right at the worst moment. She'd handed me the whole map a lifetime before I learned to read it. I trained those 4 days like a woman possessed, because for the first time in either life I was training with my eyes fully open, knowing exactly what I was running toward and exactly what had nearly taken it. In my first life, I'd been a gifted runner who half believed, somewhere underneath, that she didn't quite deserve the lane, that her job was to be useful to faster shining people. You run differently when you carry that. You hold something back. You leave a tenth on the track without knowing it. This time I held nothing back. I attacked every rep. Coach Reyes noticed. She noticed everything. And on the third day she pulled me up after a brutal set of 300s and said, squinting at her watch and then at me, "I've been coaching you for 3 years and you've never run these like this. What happened to you?" And I gave her the only true answer I could give without sounding insane. "I figured out what it's worth. That's all. I finally figured out what it's actually worth." She held my eyes for a long beat, the flat Olympic eyes that had measured 1,000 runners, and then she nodded slowly and she said, "Good. Most people don't figure that out until it's behind them." She had no idea how exactly right she was. For me, it had been behind me, a whole life and a death behind me, and I'd been handed the rarest thing in the world, the chance to figure it out while it was still in front of me again. I was not going to waste the second knowing the way I'd wasted the first not knowing. I did not break up with Mason in those 4 days, and people always ask me why. The answer runs underneath this whole story, because a breakup was a fight, and a fight was a stage, and Mason was magnificent on a stage. He could turn any confrontation into a drama where he was the wounded one, and I was the unreasonable one, and he'd weep and reach for me, and I had a lifetime of being reachable. The one thing he had no move against was a girl who simply, quietly, was no longer available to be used. So I gave him nothing to push against. I was warm, I was his, and inside I was a sealed lane he couldn't enter, and I let him walk toward Trials Day with no idea that the crutch he was counting on had quietly, permanently, walked off on her own 2 feet. There was one person I let in a little, and that was Priya. She was a middle-distance runner, my training partner, the closest thing to a real friend I had in those years, and in my first life I'd lost her too, let her go the way I let everything go once Mason filled up all the air in my world. Priya had never liked Mason. She'd clocked him from the start, in both lives, with the unsentimental eye of a girl who'd grown up with 3 brothers and could smell a free rider at 50 meters. This time, the second of the 4 days, we were cooling down together after a session, walking laps in the dusk, and she said out of nowhere, "You seem like yourself again." I didn't even realize you'd stopped. I asked her what she meant. She shrugged, the way you shrug at something you've been wanting to say for a while. For like a year you've been kind of dimmed, running Mason's errands, disappearing every time he snaps his fingers, getting quieter. This week you came back. I don't know what changed, but I'm glad. And then she stopped walking and looked at me dead on and said the thing I'd needed someone to say my whole first life. "You're the best runner on this track, Sloane. You, not him.
He's good.
You're special. Don't you ever let that boy make you forget which one of you the clock loves more." I didn't tell her that I'd died once, that I'd come back, that she was reaching me across a grave. I just hugged her, hard, on the track in the dark, this friend I'd thrown away in another life, and got back in this one. She ran at our first national meet 2 years later. We're still friends. Some of what I came back to save wasn't the squad at all. It was her. And I spent time with Toby. That mattered to me. I want to be clear because this is the hinge the whole thing turns on. I was not going to punish a 14-year-old for his brother's selfishness. In my first life, I'd loved Toby and sacrificed myself for him. In my second, I was going to love Toby and not sacrifice myself for him, and the difference between those two things is the entire moral of my life. They're not the same thing. You can care about a person with your whole heart and still refuse to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. It took me dying to learn that a love that requires your destruction isn't a higher love. It's just a cleaner word for being used. So I hung out with Toby those 4 days, easy and real, and I had no idea yet how much that would come to matter when the morning finally arrived. The morning arrived, exactly as I knew it would. Toby went down the night before, same as before, a rolled ankle in a pickup game, swollen and scared, nothing broken, everything needing a clinic and a calm adult for the day. And in the morning Mason called me, and there it was, the voice I remembered, already certain of my yes before he'd finished asking. Sloan. Toby's hurt, his ankle's bad, and Mom can't get off work, and I've got my trial. You have to take him. Skip your trial and be my injured brother's crutch for the day. You're so good with him. You can run track anytime. This is my one shot. Family's family. Please. I held the phone, and I looked at my spikes by the door, laced and ready, the spikes I'd boxed up in another life and grieved like a death, and I felt the whole weight of 2 lives hang on what I said next. And I said, calm as the clock that had been the first fair thing in my life. No, Mason. I'm running my trial. Toby's your brother. You take him, or your mom does, or you call your aunt, or you figure it out, but I'm going to be in my blocks at 10. The silence on the line was a thing I'll remember as long as I have a memory. He had never heard it from me, not really, not without a seam he could pry open into a yes. And when he spoke again, the warmth had gone cold, the real Mason surfacing for a second from under the charm. Are you serious right now? My brother's hurt and you're choosing a race? You can run any time, Sloan. This is family. I can't believe you're being this selfish. And there it was, the magic trick, the way he turned my refusal to dismantle myself into my selfishness, the way he made not being used look like cruelty. In my first life, that word, selfish, would have undone me, because a girl raised invisible will do anything not to be the bad one. But I was not that girl anymore. I'd buried her at 40 in a dispatch office. So I said, gently, because gentle was the sharpest thing I had, I love Toby. I'll help you find someone for him, right now on this call, if you want. But I'm not skipping my trial. You've got a brother to take care of, Mason. For once in your life, take care of him yourself. And I hung up and I picked up my spikes and I walked out into the most important morning of 2 lifetimes, and the rhythm was already in my feet. I want to tell you about the spikes in my hand that morning because they were the same spikes, and that's not a small thing. In my first life, on this exact morning, those spikes had stayed by the door unworn, while I drove off in flat shoes to be a crutch, and then they'd gone into a box at the back of a closet for 17 years, mud-cleated and silent, a monument to the race I skipped. I had stood over a trash can with them once and couldn't throw them away and couldn't bear to run in them. They were the most haunted object I owned. And here they were again, in my hand, on the morning that decided everything, except this time they were laced, and this time I was walking out the door wearing them instead of leaving them behind. I have thought since that the whole of my second life is contained in that one difference, the spikes by the door, picked up instead of abandoned. Same shoes. Same morning. Same careless voice on the phone. The only thing that changed was a girl who reached for the spikes instead of the car keys, who walked toward the track instead of the waiting room, who chose, for once, to run her own race instead of carry someone else's. Everything. The record, the squad, the life, the coaching, the girl by the fence, the unhaunted laps in the dark. All of it flows from that one small reach. I didn't save my life with a grand gesture. I saved it by picking up a pair of shoes. Here is the part Mason never understood, the mechanism underneath the morning, and I'll lay it out plainly, because it's the engine of everything. In my first life, by taking Toby off his hands, I gave Mason something more valuable than help. I gave him a clear morning. He showed up to his trial rested, focused, unburdened, his whole mind on the hurdles, and on a clean, focused day a bubble athlete makes the cut. That was the gift I didn't know I was giving, not babysitting, but freedom from his own life, the freedom to pour his entire self into his race while I carried everything else. And the moment I stopped carrying it, the moment I said take care of him yourself, that freedom vanished. He didn't ask me to drive his brother. He asked me to be the thing that let him not have to choose. And when I refused, he finally had to choose, and a man who has never once had to carry his own weight does not suddenly become strong on the morning it matters most. I'll tell you about my race because in my first life I never ran it, and running it in my second was a resurrection with a starting gun. The Holloway trials were on the university's good track, the 8-lane all-weather one, under a flat gray morning sky. I warmed up the way Coach Reyes taught me, deliberate, unhurried, the strides building. I felt Mason's absence in the warm-up area and didn't look for it. There was a moment in that warm-up I have to give you because it held both my lives at once. I was doing my build-up strides down the back straight, the same back straight where I'd woken mid-stride 4 days before, and somewhere in the third stride my body and my mind came fully together for the first time since I'd come back, the 18-year-old legs and the 40-year dead memory fusing into a single thing that knew exactly what it was about to do. And I thought, for one heartbeat, of the Grey Dispatch office and the vessel letting go and the soles of my feet pulsing with this exact race in the last half-second of my first life. And then I thought of the box at the back of the closet, the mud-cleated spikes I'd never thrown away and never worn, 17 years of a buried girl, and how I was wearing those same spikes right now, laced and ready, on the morning I'd box them up in another world. The whole of both my lives narrowed to a single point on that back straight. A body, a lane, a clock, and a choice I'd already made on a phone at 7 in the morning. The girl who skipped this race had died for it. The woman who came back was about to run it. And the strides felt like flying. And when they called the 400, I walked to my lane 4, the good draw, and I knelt into the blocks, and I looked down the long first straight toward the curve where I'd find out if the fourth gear had really come back with me, and I felt, not fear, but the thing I'd been chasing my whole life. The clean, fair silence before the clock starts, the one place where nothing about the loud house or the careless boy or the gray death could follow me. Just the lane. Just the clock. Just me. The gun went. I cannot fully give you the 400 meters because it's a race that happens below language, but I'll try because it's the center of everything. I went out hard and controlled the way she taught me, ate the first 200 with my whole body, hit the back straight already burning, and then I came into the final 100 where every runner's legs turn to cement, and the race stops being about speed and becomes about who refuses to slow down. And in that final 100, with the lactic acid screaming up my legs and my form starting to come apart and the wall rising up the way it does, I found the gear. The fourth gear. The one Coach Reyes said she'd seen maybe 4 times in 30 years. The one that lives in the place where everyone else only has a wall. And I poured into it everything. 17 years of silence, a gray death, a boxed pair of spikes, the girl in the waiting room, the whole accumulated weight of a life I'd thrown away. And I drove through the line not like a person but like a refusal made flesh, and I crossed it, and I ran the fastest 400 of either of my lives, a time that didn't just make the squad but cracked the program record, and I stood past the line with my hands on my head and my lungs full of fire, and my whole body ringing like a struck bell, alive. Fast, mine. Finally, in the race I died wishing I'd run. Coach Reyes was looking at her stopwatch, and then she was looking at me, and she didn't smile. She wasn't a smiler, but she walked over and she gripped my shoulder hard, and she said one word, low, just for me. There. Just there. As in, there it is. There's the fourth gear. There's the thing I told you not to waste and you didn't, this time, and that was worth more to me than the record and the squad and everything else, because in this life I had not made her stand at a start line with my name on her list, and an empty lane where I should have been. I had shown up. I had run. I had been at the worst moment in my blocks. 2 miles and a whole world away, Mason was having the opposite morning, and I reconstructed it later from Toby mostly, and I'll give it to you because it's the exact counterweight to mine. With no one to offload Toby onto, Mason had been forced to do the thing he'd spent his whole life arranging never to do, take care of his own family himself. And he was bad at it, in the specific way that people who've always been carried are bad at carrying, not because they're incapable but because they're furious about it, and the fury eats everything. Toby told me about it years later, and there was still a flatness in his voice when he did. Mason had shown up at the house that morning already enraged that I'd said no, and he'd taken it out on the kid, snapping at him to hurry up, driving too fast and too hard to the clinic, sitting in the waiting room radiating a resentment that a frightened 14-year-old could feel coming off him in waves, checking his phone, checking the clock, making Toby feel like the sprained ankle was a personal betrayal that was ruining Mason's life. There was no held hand, no terrible vending machine lunch, no making the kid laugh. Just a golden boy seething in a plastic chair because the world had, for one single morning, asked something of him instead of for him. And the clinic was slow, the way clinics are, and by the time Mason had dumped Toby with a neighbor and torn across town to the track, he was late for his warm-up, frazzled, his whole head full of grievance and traffic and the unfairness of having to be his own brother's keeper for one day, full of everything except the hurdles. And the hurdles do not forgive a cluttered head. The 110 is 10 barriers and the narrowest margins in the sport, all rhythm and nerve, and a hurdler who's even slightly off, slightly tight, slightly distracted, slightly behind on his warm-up, clips a barrier, and a clipped barrier is 0.3 of a second, and 0.3 of a second, on a bubble, is the whole world. He clipped one. Toby, who heard the recap from someone who was there, said Mason caught the 7th hurdle with his trail leg, stumbled, recovered, finished, but the rhythm was gone, and the time was gone with it. He missed the last roster spot by 0.3 seconds. 0.3. The width of a flinch. The exact margin, I have always believed, of the calm morning I refused to hand him. The difference between a hurdler with a clear head and a hurdler who'd spent the morning being, for the first time in his life, his own brother's crutch. He ran 0.32 slow, and the last roster spot went to the athlete one place above him, and Mason Hale, golden boy, beautiful careless Mason who had never once in his life had a need go unmet, did not make the squad. The window came down on him exactly the way it had come down on me in another life, except he'd brought it down himself, with his own choices, on the one morning he finally had to make them alone. I saw him break. It happened by the results board, where the roster was posted, and I was there because Coach Reyes had pulled me up to point at my name and my record, and Mason came through the crowd looking for his own name and not finding it, and I watched the realization move across his beautiful careless face in stages.
First the certainty that it was a mistake.
Then the frantic recount. He was so close, 0.3, surely there was an appeal, a second run, a margin that thin couldn't really be final. Then, slowly, the understanding that 0.3 is not nothing, that 0.3 is the whole world, that the window doesn't reopen for charm or for grief or for the boy who almost made it. And then his face did the thing I'd waited 2 lifetimes to see. The thing I now know is the specific signature of a person whose certainties collapse all at once. It cracked.
He made a sound.
Not loud. The small, terrible sound of a golden boy discovering that the world will not, in fact, always arrange itself around him, that it only ever did because women like me were quietly holding it in place, and that the moment one of us let go, the whole thing came down by exactly 0.3 of a second. I knew that sound. That's the thing that stopped me, standing there. I knew it from the inside. I'd made it myself, in another life, alone, the day I understood that the window had closed on me, and there was no reopening it, no second day, no appeal. Mason was making, in public, by a results board, the exact sound I'd made in private in a clinic waiting room 17 years and 1 death before. The same sound. The difference was only in the cause. I'd made it because I gave my future away to a careless boy who didn't love me. He was making it because the girl whose future he'd assumed he could spend had finally declined to be spent. One of us had been the floor. One of us had been the thing standing on the floor when it finally got up and walked away. And the wheel had come all the way around on the same track, by the same kind of margin, and I stood there and watched a man learn in one afternoon what it had cost me a whole gray life to learn, that the windows don't reopen, and the world doesn't bend, and the only person who was ever bending it for you was the one you'd been standing on.
I did not go to him.
I want that on the record, because it's the heart of who I'd become. I didn't walk over and explain that he'd lost by the precise weight of the morning I refused to carry for him. I didn't deliver a speech. I stood by the board with Coach Reyes's hand on my shoulder and my record beside my name, and I let Mason break alone in the crowd, because his breaking was not my project and never had been. The only thing I'd done was run my own race and decline, for one morning, to be the thing that let him skip his own life. The rest he did himself, 3/10 at a time. And then something happened that I had not predicted, and it remains one of the quiet vindications of my whole second life. Toby found me. He'd gotten a ride to the track once his ankle was strapped, and he came up to me by the board, limping, 14 and earnest, and reading the situation faster than his brother ever could. And he didn't congratulate me first. The first thing he said, looking at the ground, was, "Mason wanted you to skip your race to babysit me."
Didn't he?
And I said carefully, "He asked me to take you for the day, yeah." And Toby's jaw did something, and he looked up at me, and he said, with a clean, brutal moral clarity that 14-year-olds sometimes have and adults usually lose, "That's so messed up. It's my ankle. He should have taken me. He just didn't want it to be his problem." And then, quieter, "You were always nicer to me than he was. I used to think it was 'cause you were dating him. But it wasn't, was it? You were just nice." I had to look away, because in my first life I had given this kid my entire future and he'd never known the price, and in my second I'd given him nothing but honest friendship and he'd seen straight through to the truth of his own brother. Toby was on my side. The villain's own brother was on my side. There is a justice in that I still can't fully explain, except to say that sometimes the people closest to a careless man are the ones who felt the carelessness longest, and the first chance they get to name it, they do. I want to stay with Toby a moment, because his thread is one of the quiet graces of my second life, and it runs all the way to the end. He never forgot that morning. Not the ankle, but the lesson of it, the sight of his brother treating a sprained ankle like an imposition and trying to make his girlfriend skip the most important day of her life to handle it. It marked him, in a good way. It taught him, young, exactly the kind of man he didn't want to become. We stayed in touch over the years, loosely, the way you stay in touch with a kid you once liked who turns into a person you respect. He grew up steady and kind and unselfish, the opposite of his brother, and I always believed, though I never said it to him, that part of why he turned out the way he did was that he'd seen, at 14, with his own eyes, what carelessness costs the people who love a careless man. He'd watched his brother nearly throw a woman's whole future into a clinic waiting room, and he'd decided not to be that. The villain made his own brother into a good man, by accident, by being a cautionary tale up close. There's a strange mercy in that I've never gotten over. Mason came to find me 3 days later, of course. They always do. He turned up outside my place in the evening, the charm scraped off, hollowed out, and he asked me, lost more than angry, how it had happened. How I'd cracked the program record when I was supposed to be the easy one, the sure thing, the girl who could afford to give up a morning. How he'd missed by 0.3 when he was so close. He genuinely didn't understand, and watching him not understand showed me the exact shape of the blindness that had ruined us both. He looked wrecked. I'll give him that. Whatever else I felt the plain human pity you feel at a person whose whole map of the world has just been proven wrong. And the thing he kept circling back to, the thing he could not get past, was the unfairness of it as he saw it. That he'd been so close, that 0.3 was nothing, that surely there was a rerun, a waitlist, an appeal, surely a margin that thin couldn't really be the end. He did not understand that 0.3 is not nothing. On a bubble, 0.3 is the whole world. It is the line between a life in the sport and a memory of one, and it does not care how close you came, and it does not reopen for charm or grief or the boy who almost made it. I knew that better than anyone alive. I'd lived on the wrong side of a margin like that for 17 silent years. I died on the wrong side of it. And now Mason stood on my doorstep discovering, in one evening, the immovable cruelty of a number that I'd had to lose an entire life to learn, and I felt the strange vertigo of watching him take, in a few minutes, the lesson it had taken me a death to absorb. So I told him, not the rebirth, not the death, not the soles of my feet pulsing with a race I never ran. The mechanism. I said, Mason, when I took Toby off your hands that morning in another world, the world where I said yes, you got something you didn't even know you were getting. You got a clear head. You got to show up rested and focused with nothing on your mind but the hurdles, because I was carrying everything else. That's how you made the cut. Not because you were good enough on your own. Because I was holding your whole life off your shoulders, so you could run light. I stopped, corrected the slip. That's what you were asking for. You weren't asking me to help your brother. You were asking me to carry your life, so you could keep your race. And the second I stopped carrying it, the second you had to be your own brother's crutch for one morning, you couldn't run light anymore, and you missed by 3/10. That's not me beating you, Mason. That's just you, finally running with your own weight on your back. Turns out you'd never done it before. I'd been carrying it the whole time, and calling it love, and you'd been letting me, and calling it the same. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, the whole runner I'd always been under the supportive girlfriend he'd reduced to a logistic solution, and I think in that moment he finally understood that he hadn't lost me on trials day. He'd been losing me for 2 years every time he handed me his weight to carry and called it family, and trials day was just the morning the scale finally tipped. He left without another word. I never carried anything of his again. And that, more than the board, more than the 0.3, was the moment Mason Hale truly broke. Not in the crowd, where it was loud, but on my doorstep, quietly, where he finally saw. I took the scholarship. I want you to sit in those 4 words, because in my first life they were the great unbearable if I carried to my grave, if only I'd run that morning. And in my second they were just true. I joined the Holloway squad. I trained under Coach Reyes on a fully funded place, and I gave the 400 meters the life I'd been about to throw away, and it gave me a life back, the way it always would have, if I'd only stood in the blocks. The years after were the years I should have had the first time, and I want to tell you about the one that meant the most because it isn't the one you'd expect. It wasn't a national final, though there were a couple of those. It was an ordinary training evening, maybe 2 years into the squad, when I caught myself jogging a warm-up lap in the last of the daylight and realized that I was happy. Not the desperate, grateful happy of a girl who's finally been seen, but a low, steady happy, the happy of a body doing the thing it was built for, in a place that had always been fair to me, with nothing owed to anyone. I had spent my whole first life running toward people who'd never once run toward me. And now I was just running for me, in the cleanest justice I'd ever known, and there was nobody I had to earn it from. That lap is the thing I'd come back from the dead for, more than the records, more than the revenge. The simple, unhaunted joy of running in my own lane. You'd have to have had it taken to understand what it is to get it back. And I want to say something about my family since I've told you about the Loud House, because it's part of how the second life differed from the first. They didn't change. That's the honest truth. The checked-out mother stayed checked out. The rotating cast kept rotating, and in my second life, as in my first, none of them came to my meets, not the trials, not the national finals, not once. For a long time in my first life, I'd run partly in the hope that if I ran fast enough, somebody from that house would finally come, finally see, finally treat me the way the clock did. They never did, and the not coming was a wound I carried for decades. But here's what the second life taught me that the first one couldn't. I stopped running for them. I stopped needing the house to come. Coach Reyes came. Priya came. Toby came, eventually, with his kids. The track gave me a family that showed up, and I learned slowly over years that you do not have to keep auditioning for the love of people who've decided not to give it. You can simply walk out of that audition and into your own lane, where the clock is fair and the people who matter are in the stands, and you can run for the joy of it instead of for the approval of a house that was never going to clap. That, more than any record, is what I got back. Not their love. My freedom from needing it. I stayed in the sport. I'm a coach now. That's how it ended up. The long arc of it. I run a program for kids, the fast ones from the loud houses, the ones with chaotic homes and a fourth gear they don't know they have yet, and I tell them the thing Coach Reyes told me, leaning on a fence in the cold. The body's got a short window, and the world's got a long list of reasons you should give it to somebody else.
Don't.
Most of them are too young to know what I mean. I say it anyway. Someone said it to me a lifetime before I understood it, and the saying is its own kind of grace whether or not it lands in time. There's one girl I think of when I tell this part. She came to my program at 15 from a house I recognized. The loud kind, the kind with a checked-out mother and a rotating cast at the door, the kind I'd run out of myself. She had it, the thing, the fourth gear. I saw it the first week, the way she got faster instead of slower when the workout started to hurt. And she had the other thing too, the dangerous thing, the thing I'd had. She was a giver, a fixer, the kind of girl who'd already learned to make herself small and useful, so the house would let her be. Midway through her second season, a boy started turning up at practice, and I watched her start to dim. Watched the old machine begin to run in her exactly the way it had run in me. Watched her start skipping reps to take his calls. So, I pulled her aside one evening by the fence, in the cold, and I told her the truth I'd had to die to learn. There are going to be people, I said, who need you somewhere else at exactly the wrong moment. And they're going to make it sound like love. They're going to make staying in your own lane sound selfish. Listen to me. A person who asks you to give up your race to make their life easier is not asking you for love. They're telling you what they think you're for. And you get to disagree. She looked at me like I was speaking a language she half knew. I don't know if it landed. But the next week the boy stopped coming around, and she ran a personal best, and I had to go stand by the fence for a minute because it was almost too much to watch a girl from a loud house stay in her own lane, when I knew, better than anyone alive, the exact weight of the morning she'd just refused to give away. I saw Mason one final time, years later, and it's the truest measure of how far the two roads ran apart. I was at a regional meet, working in my coach's jacket with my clipboard and my kids warming up on the infield, the whole apparatus of a real life in the sport I'd nearly thrown away.
And I saw him in the stands.
He looked smaller than I remembered, dimmer, the careless beauty worn down into something ordinary and a little defeated. He'd never made it in athletics, he'd been good but not great, and he'd spent his one window assuming the world would carry him the way I always had, and when it didn't, he drifted out of the sport the way people do. He was there, I gathered, because a nephew was racing, Toby's kid, as it turned out. Toby had grown up fine, grown up good, and we'd stayed in loose, friendly touch over the years. The villain's brother and I, a small, strange thread of grace running through the whole thing.
Mason saw me.
He saw the jacket, the clipboard, the kids, the unmistakable fact of the life I'd built in the place he'd tried to make me skip. And I watched the recognition cross his face, and behind it something complicated and old. He came down. He stopped a few feet away and said my name, just my name, Sloane, the way they always do at the end. And I waited to feel the old things, the anger, the hurt, the love. What I felt instead was the cleanest, simplest thing. I felt the meet waiting for me, my kids on the infield, a girl in lane 4 I'd been working with for a season who had the 4th gear and didn't know it yet. There was a whole life out there with my hands full of it, and Mason Hale was standing in front of me asking, in the silence, for a piece, and I found I had none to spare, not from cruelty, but because every part of me was finally, fully in use, spoken for by my own life, with nothing left over to carry for anyone who hadn't earned it. It's good to see you, Mason, I said, and I meant it the distant way you can mean a thing that's lost the power to hurt you. I've got a runner-up. I have to go. And I didn't offer him anything else, not a coffee, not a place in the part of my life that came after. I gave him a small, real, final nod, not the warm, pliant smile of the girl who'd have carried him anywhere. That girl was at rest now, buried with the spikes she boxed up in a life that no longer counts. And then I turned and walked back toward the track, toward my kids, toward the start line, and I left him in the stands. And I want to end where it all lived, which is the line. Because that evening after the meet, when everyone had gone, I did a thing I do sometimes. I changed into my own spikes. I still run, just for myself, an old woman's version of fast now but fast enough, and I walked out to lane 4 under the empty sky, and I knelt into the blocks on the track I'd nearly never gotten to run on, and I ran 1/400 alone for nobody in the cleanest justice I'd ever known. I want you to be on the track with me for it, because it's the whole story compressed into 40-some seconds. The gun in my head, the hard controlled first 200, the body older now but the memory exact. The back straight, the burn coming up the legs the way it always has, the way it did when I was 12 crossing that field and 20 crossing the line at Halloway, and the way it would on the last day I'm ever able to run. And then the final 100 where the legs turn to cement and the wall rises, and I went looking for the gear, fainter now, banked down by the years, but there, still mine, the 4th gear that lives where everyone else is only a wall. And I found it, and I poured into it everything one more time, the loud house and the careless boy, and the gray office and the box spikes and the buried girl, and the whole long impossible road of 2 lives. And I drove through the line like a refusal made flesh, exactly the way I had on trials day, Exactly the way I never got to in the life that ended in a gray office with my feet remembering a race I skipped. I crossed the line alone in the dark, lungs full of fire. No clock, no crowd, no one to earn it from. And I stood there past the line with my hands on my head, breathing, and I understood that this was the thing I had come back from the dead for. Not the records. Not the revenge.
This.
The simple act of crossing a line in my own lane, for no reason but that the lane is mine, and always was. I think about that morning sometimes. The phone ringing, the careless voice, the line, "Skip your trial and be my injured brother's crutch for the day," and how in one life I said yes, and lost the track and died with the ghost of a race in the soles of my feet, and in another life I said no and knelt into the blocks and ran it. The whole divergence of two lives, the difference between a waiting room and a record, came down to a single word into a phone on a gray morning.
No.
The smallest word. The one I'd been trained my whole invisible life never to say to a man who needed me. And it turned out to be the fastest I ever ran. People think revenge has to be loud. I thought so too. In the long silence of my first death, the speeches, the confrontations, the satisfying ruin. But the most complete revenge I ever took was to kneel into the blocks and run the best 400 of my life, while the man who told me to skip it discovered, by exactly 0.3 of a second, what it costs to build your whole future on a woman who's finally decided to carry her own weight and nothing else. I never raised my voice at him. I just stopped being the thing that let him run light. And it turned out he'd never been able to run with his own weight on his back, not once, because I'd been carrying it the whole time and calling it love. The morning I set it down, he ran true for the first time, and true was 0.3 too slow. People ask me sometimes, carefully, the way you ask a runner about a race she lost, whether I feel guilty, whether running my own trial, knowing it would cost Mason the cut, wasn't a kind of cruelty, wearing the clothes of self-respect. And I've made myself sit with that question honestly, because a coach who won't examine her own conscience has no business shaping anyone else's. Here's the truest answer I have. I did not do one single thing to Mason Hale. I didn't trip him over a hurdle. I didn't sabotage his trial. I didn't take a spot that was his. All I did was show up to my own race and run as fast as I could. The most innocent act in the entire sport, the exact thing every other athlete on that track did without anyone calling it cruel. The only reason it cost Mason anything is that his whole plan depended on me not doing it, on me being elsewhere, carrying his life, so he could run light. He'd built his future on my absence from my own. And when I simply refused to be absent, the structure he'd built on my disappearance fell down. That's not cruelty. That's not even revenge, really not in the way people mean it. It's just what happens when the person who's been carrying the weight finally puts it down. The thing that was balanced on top of her falls. The people who call a woman cruel for that are almost always the people who were standing on her. I stood under Mason for 2 years. I nearly stood under him forever, in a gray life, until a vessel let go behind my eye. I am not sorry I stepped out. Stepping out from under someone isn't an attack on them. It only feels that way to the person who'd forgotten they were standing on you at all. My spikes sit by the door now, laced, ready, the way they were on the morning that split 2 lives apart. Some evenings I run a lap in the dark for no one, and every time my feet find the rhythm, I remember the girl who woke mid-stride into her second life with the track already moving under her, and I'm so grateful she made the choice she made, because she didn't just win back the squad that morning. She won back the lane. She won back the clock, the cleanest fair thing she ever knew, and the simple, unhaunted joy of running in it. And she never, ever, skipped her own race again. And when I die again, properly, this time, an old woman who got to run, I hope it's the rhythm I feel in the soles of my feet, the way I felt it the first time in the gray office at the end. But this time it won't be the ghost of a race I never ran. It'll be the echo of 10,000 I did, trials and finals and ordinary evenings and one solo 400 under an empty sky for nobody at all. It'll be the feeling of a life I kept instead of gave away. That's the only revenge that ever mattered in the end. Not his ruin by 0.3 of a second. My race. The fact that I got to run it, after all, after everything, because one gray morning at 7 o'clock, I picked up a pair of spikes instead of a set of car keys, and said the smallest, fastest word I know.
No.
the smallest word, and the fastest I ever ran. It cost me a careless boy, and it bought me back my whole life. And given the same phone, the same gray morning, the same weeping voice on the line, I would say it again 1,000 times and run, every time, toward my own lane.